Coming up, the Knicks and Celtics take control of their first round series. This is Locked On Game to Game NBA.
Every game, every team, every angle. Locked On Game to Game, your team every day.
Welcome in. You're listening to Locked On Game to Game NBA. Local experts join us to go over the playoff matchups from last night in the NBA. I'm your host, Kainani Stevens. Thank you for making Locked On your first listen every single weekday. The Knicks have put the Cavs up against the wall after winning Game 4 in Cleveland last night. Both Locked On Knicks and Cavs go over how New York got to a 3-1 lead.
The New York Knicks have taken a commanding 3-1 series lead over the Cleveland Cavaliers after sweeping their home slate and heading back to Cleveland for Game 5. Alex Wolf here from Locked On Knicks, and the Knicks won 102-93 over Cleveland. A huge fourth quarter. Just helps rebound from a potentially disastrous third where the Cavs came back. They erased a 15-point deficit, managed to get all the way back and even take the lead. But Jalen Brunson, Josh Hart, RJ Barrett, all huge down the stretch. RJ with 26 points, Josh Hart 19, Jalen Brunson 29. Absolutely controlled the flow of the game down the stretch and finished things off for the Knicks, as well as some huge defensive and offensive rebounding from Mitchell Robinson and Josh Hart and Isaiah Hartenstein to close this thing out. So speaking of closing out, the Knicks might be doing that on Wednesday if they can do this and complete a little gentleman's sweep. So we'll have more for you on Locked On Knicks.
Hey everyone, how's it going? Evan Dammerel here, co-host of Locked On Cavs, and the Locked On Now takeaway after the Cleveland Cavaliers dropped Game 4 to the New York Knicks. Objectively speaking, this was Donovan Mitchell's worst game ever as a Cavalier. It's kind of hard to believe that since he's just been so dominant at points this season, but Mitchell just did not have anything going. And if it wasn't for Darius Garland, this would have been a repeat of Game 3 for Cleveland in just similar blowout fashion. But unfortunately, it feels like Cleveland's season is over as the Cavs got their best performance possible from numerous role players and their stars, whether it's Garland, Mobley, or Allen, and it just wasn't enough to beat the Knicks. Cleveland could win Wednesday, but they are 0-4 at the Garden this season, and they could drag this out or get ready for vacation. Hear about this and more on Monday's Locked On Cavs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.
The Warriors and Kings went down to the wire, but the reigning champs held home court. The series is now tied going into a huge Game 5. Locked On Warriors has more on a crucial win.
The Golden State Warriors survived a Chris Webber-style mistake from Steph Curry late in the game, and the Warriors win to make this a best-of-3 series. I'm Cyrus Sautzes with your Locked On Warriors Locked On Now recap of the Golden State Warriors surviving a thriller at Chase Center, 126-125, despite Steph Curry calling a timeout with 42 seconds left when the Warriors didn't have any. The Warriors leading by 5 at that point. Excuse me. The mistake led to a technical free throw and a possession by the Kings, which led to a De'Aaron Fox 3. They had a chance to win the game, but Harrison Barnes missed the 3 at the end, and the Golden State Warriors have now made this a best-of-3 series. Game 5 is Wednesday. You can follow the program on Twitter at Locked On Dubs to find out guest and time of show information.
The Celtics now have the upper hand on the Hawks after winning in Atlanta on Sunday. Locked On Celtics has more on Boston's win and how they're now going up 3-1.
It wasn't easy, but the Boston Celtics get that 3-1 series lead with that Game 4 win in Atlanta. I'm John Corrales of the Locked On Celtics podcast, and the key to this game was the rebounding. The Celtics getting 49-42 advantage over the Hawks, and Robert Williams was just a monster in there. Joe Mazzulla didn't go double big in Game 3, and it cost the Celtics. In this one, he went double big a lot more often, and it paid off. Robert Williams, the 15 rebounds, 3 offensive rebounds. He saved a couple of clutch possessions down the stretch, found Jaylen Brown for a three-pointer that basically sealed this thing. Brown and Tatum, 31 points apiece. Brown was 1 of 7 with the mask on. Then all of a sudden he took the mask off, and he was 11 of 15 after that. So 3 of 4 from 3. He did everything he needed to do. The Celtics, my favorite stat, 0 points from Al Horford, team high plus 17. Team effort to get this job done. The Hawks fought. They were tough, but the Celtics fought back and answered every run. Now they get to go home and do what 95% of the teams in this position do, and close out the series.
Hello, friends. My name is Brad Rowland, and the Atlanta Hawks fall at the hands of the Boston Celtics on this Sunday evening by a final score of 129 to 121 at home. And with this loss, the Hawks now fall to down 3-1 in the first round series against Boston. Not a huge surprise all the way across the board. The Hawks were competitive in this game. Unfortunately, they had a bad start to the game and were digging a hole the entire way, trying to get out of it. They did a good job throughout being competitive. They won the second half of this game. In fact, they won the last three quarters of this game by a single point, but still they were managed to do that. And the Hawks did have some strong performances from Trae Young, DeJounte Murray, DeAndre Hunter. Defensively, they had some interesting moments, but point of attack stuff was a problem as it has been for the Hawks all year long, and as was shot making after Game 3, where the Hawks made basically everything to win their one game in the series so far. Game 4 was not as friendly. They were certainly below average in their efficiency, and it was not enough to overcome a very strong effort from Boston as it has been throughout the series. We'll get into how all this game transpired, what's to come in Game 5, and more on Locked On Hawks podcast.
The Timberwolves survived in overtime just barely to keep their season alive. Locked On Timberwolves recaps that win in Minnesota.
It wasn't pretty, and in fact, at times, it was almost historically ugly, but the Minnesota Timberwolves forced a Game 5 back in Denver on Tuesday night. I'm Ben Beacon, host of the Locked On Wolves podcast. The Minnesota Timberwolves were back and forth with Denver throughout the game. They were down 4 at halftime. They took a small lead going to the fourth quarter. The Timberwolves built a 12-point lead with 2 minutes and 50 seconds to play in the game, but Denver scored the last 12 points of regulation in an epic Wolves collapse. Minnesota entered overtime with a timeout in their pocket in what can only be described at the end of regulation as a questionable stretch of coaching from Chris Finch. The Wolves again led by 7 with about a minute and a half to go in overtime. The Nuggets got to within 1 before an Anthony Edwards step back dagger 3 over Aaron Gordon gave the Wolves a 4-point lead. They ended up winning by 6. This was a huge win despite that terrible collapse at the end. Ant had 34 in this game. Karl-Anthony Towns had a double-double but fouled out in overtime. We're going to break it all down on Locked On Wolves. Subscribe to Locked On Wolves for all things Timberwolves.
That's a wrap for this edition of Locked On Game to Game NBA. Thank you for making Locked On your first listen every weekday. Now that it's the playoffs, make sure you're subscribed to Locked On NBA and your favorite team's Locked On podcast on YouTube and wherever else you get your podcasts from. I'm Kainani Stevens. This has been Locked On Game to Game.